Hello, this is Ken Kuminski, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the March 26th issue of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Let's start out with the lines, the prices, the anxiety. Can air travel get any worse? Travelers are waiting hours at security checkpoints, paying top dollar for tickets and worrying about safety after a deadly crash at LaGuardia. By Christine Chung and Ceylan Yejinsu. War is raging in the Middle East. Passengers are waiting in 4-hour security lines. Airfares are spiking, and now a deadly runway collision at LaGuardia Airport has renewed questions about the safety of U.S. air traffic control. All this comes at one of the busiest travel periods of the year. If airline passengers anticipated a relaxing spring break, the uncertainty has left them reeling instead. We're seeing a perfect storm of travel disruption right now, says Sally French, a travel expert at the personal finance website NerdWallet. In a lot of ways, travelers are having to grapple with that "should I travel now?" question on a level not seen since the COVID-19 pandemic. U.S. airlines expect more than 170 million passengers to fly in March and April, a new high. More than 2 million travelers have passed through security checkpoints almost every day this month. At the same time, Transportation Security Administration officers working without pay during the 5-week-old partial government shutdown have called out at record rates, and more than 450 have quit. This has created an unpredictable experience at airports, with wait times varying wildly by city and day. Travelers have complained about missing flights while stuck in line and sleeping at airports because of flight disruptions. Many have said they are considering canceling upcoming trips. This type of dysfunction is not sustainable, said Jeff Freeman, the president and chief executive of the U.S. Travel Association. These are signs of an extraordinarily dysfunctional government. It will lead to people pulling back in travel, and I think we're seeing some of that now. In recent days, travelers said they had endured unnerving scenes at airports around the country, crowds that resembled mobs, lines that snaked around even outside terminals, armed immigration officers in bulletproof vests observing passengers. On Sunday, Andre Mullen, 50, of Rockville Center, New York, headed to Kennedy International Airport about 2.5 hours ahead of his 8 a.m. JetBlue flight to Atlanta. He expected to see a long line. Instead, it was just a sea of people with no lines, no order, no nothing, he said. While waiting, he called JetBlue customer service to be rebooked on an afternoon departure, knowing that he'd miss his morning flight. Ultimately, it took him 6 hours to get to the gate. Getting out of New York is on a whole new level, Mr. Mullen said. It really was a tinderbox. Later that night, an Air Canada Express jet and a fire truck collided on a runway at LaGuardia Airport, killing both pilots, injuring dozens, and shutting down the airport for hours. Since reopening on Monday afternoon, LaGuardia has been operating with one runway, leading to hundreds of cancellations and flight delays on top of the long security waits. Nina Tishava, 52, slept on a bench at George Bush Intercontinental Airport in Houston after spending 5 hours in a security line only to miss her plane on Sunday. On Monday, she waited for her rebooked flight home to New Mexico. She wandered around the airport. She said she spotted several clusters of immigration and customs enforcement agents standing around, many sipping coffee. In a recent open letter to Congress, the chief executives of America's major airlines called for TSA officers to be paid, complaining that air travel was once again being used as a political football amid another government shutdown. They said airlines were taking all possible actions, holding flights for passengers and rebooking them on new ones. to mitigate disruption, adding that the obstacles came at a pivotal time for the travel industry. With spring break traveling in full swing, FIFA World Cup 2026 right around the corner, and celebrations for America's 250th birthday throughout the year, the stakes are especially high, they wrote. Travelers say they are feeling apprehensive about upcoming trips, citing reasons including onerous security waits, airfare pushed higher by soaring oil prices, and safety concerns as the war rages in the Middle East. On Sunday, the State Department advised all Americans abroad to exercise caution. Lee Ann Lehrman, a 57-year-old from California, was supposed to be on vacation with her husband in London this week, but as their travel date approached, she said she became consumed by feelings of anxiety and dread. She canceled the trip at the last minute. At first, I felt embarrassed to be traveling as an American overseas because of our political situation, Ms. Lehrman said. Then there was the cancellation of global entry and TSA delays, and now with the war, I quite frankly feel unsafe. A survey conducted last week of more than 1,000 travelers by Global Rescue, a company that provides evacuation and field rescue services, found that more than half said they were at least moderately concerned about being targeted abroad. Concern about anti-American sentiment is no longer fringe, it's mainstream, said Dan Richards, Global Rescue's chief executive and a member of the Commerce Department's Travel and Tourism Advisory Board. That signals a meaningful shift in how travelers are evaluating personal risk tied to global perception. Colette, a global tour operator, experienced a 6% drop in new bookings for international travel in the first week of March compared with the same time last year, said Jeff Roy, the company's executive vice president and chief revenue officer. Alice Graham and her husband planned 3 international trips this year to Europe and Japan, but canceled all of them because of the travel disruptions caused by the war with Iran. Though they booked flexible options, they still paid more than $1,200 in cancellation fees. After seeing the hours-long TSA lines at airports over the weekend, Ms. Graham said she felt relieved about her decision. It feels way too much of a risk and hassle to leave the U.S. right now, said Ms. Graham, a 46-year-old from Boston. Planes are dodging missiles in the sky, and we started a war, which makes us a huge target. Ms. Graham said she was considering a domestic trip to the West Coast in the summer if the long wait times at airports improve. It feels like the pandemic again, she said, when you know in your gut that the best and safest option is to stay home. The next article. After standing up to Trump over Greenland, Denmark's prime minister leads an election. Mette Frederiksen's party fell far short of a majority, but analysts say she is still in the best position to form a new government, by Maya Tekeli and Jeffrey Gentleman. The center-left party of Mette Frederiksen, Denmark's prime minister, was leading in parliamentary elections on Tuesday, but fell far short of a majority, potentially setting her up for a grueling battle to form a new government. With all the ballots counted, Ms. Frederiksen's Social Democrats came out ahead, but won less than a quarter of the vote in a highly fractured political field. The result was about what had been expected, and analysts said it left her in the best position to try to forge a new governing coalition. But it was still her party's worst performance in more than 100 years, according to Danish media outlets, and indicated that the woman who gained notoriety for standing up to President Trump over Greenland may now have to wage political battles closer to home. Addressing supporters hours after the vote, Ms. Frederiksen said she was disappointed that we did not receive more votes. I had hoped for a better result. Ms. Frederiksen had been the dominant force in Danish politics. A third term could make her Denmark's longest-serving leader since World War II. After so many years on the scene, she is vulnerable to voter fatigue, and the results signal that a new term could prove challenging. Voters are quite simply tired of Mette Frederiksen, said Johannes Andersen, a political scientist at Aalborg University. The way she says she is not afraid to take power or set directions for how people should behave, that is not many voters' cup of tea. That's something other parties, especially on the extremes, have been playing to and are capitalizing on, he added. It reflects a moment of frustration. In her post-election comments, the Prime Minister acknowledged that her coalition government was never popular, but she added, "I believe it served the country and benefited Denmark in a turbulent time." It was still mathematically possible for a band of other parties, possibly from the right, to scrape together enough support to form a government without her. But analysts said that seemed unlikely for now, and that Ms. Frederiksen may look to left-leaning parties to hammer out a new coalition over the next several weeks. Bent Winther, one of Denmark's leading political analysts, said in an interview that the results were a major setback for the Prime Minister's party, but given how Parliament is likely to be composed, Mr. Winther said, it's very difficult to see a government without her. Despite the uncertainty of coalition negotiations ahead, Ms. Frederiksen struck a note of resolve. Denmark needs a stable government and a competent government, she said. We are ready to take the lead. Ms. Frederiksen, 48, campaigned as an exemplar of the new left, hawkish on foreign policy, tough on immigrants, but big on social welfare. She earned a lot of points back home for taking on Mr. Trump, who was insisting on snatching Greenland, an enormous Arctic island that has been part of Denmark for more than 300 years. She called in European allies to back her up, and the Danish military even laid plans to blow up airfields in Greenland to prevent American troops from landing. But it was domestic issues that voters seemed most concerned about, according to polls, and Ms. Frederiksen's centrist flexibility could not satisfy everyone. Environmental matters and the question of how strictly to regulate Danish farmers was one big issue. Another has been a potential wealth tax that the heads of Lego and many other Danish companies opposed, and which detractors called a jealousy tax. Ms. Frederiksen and the left-leaning parties supported it. The right did not. Ms. Frederiksen has been steeped in working-class values from the beginning. Her father was a union leader, and she grew up in Aalborg, a factory town in the Jutland region near Denmark's northern tip. Friends back home remember her being strident about her political opinions since she was young. In high school, she was punched in the face by a skinhead for standing up for immigrant children. She entered Parliament at 24, going on to become Denmark's youngest prime minister at 41. Her tenure has been shaped by crisis, from the COVID-19 pandemic to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, as well as by her increasingly acrimonious clashes with Mr. Trump. In more recent years, she's demonstrated how she can form alliances with politicians of different stripes, and analysts say her government's harsh rules on asylum seekers are markedly different from what she believed in when she was young. She will need the help of her foreign minister, Lars Løkke Rasmussen, the leader of the more moderate political party, which is actually called the Moderates. A former prime minister, Mr. Rasmussen is widely seen as likable and reliable in the ultimate swing vote. His party won about 8% of the vote, but its support will be key to forming a majority in Parliament. Parties on the extreme left and right also performed relatively well, giving them a potential role in forming the next coalition. Mr. Winther, the political analyst, said Ms. Frederiksen will likely have to make difficult concessions to politicians either on the right or the left to win their support. This could take time, he said, possibly weeks, even months. Her party tried to put the best face on the results. I am satisfied that we remain Denmark's largest party, said Christian Rabjerg Madsen, a spokesman for the Social Democrats. Now the task is to see whether we can negotiate a government, one that is operational and acts decisively, and move Denmark in a more just direction. As a reminder, you are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The time is now about 16 minutes past the hour. Next, what we know about the floods in Hawaii. There were no deaths reported, but hundreds of people were rescued and thousands evacuated as a series of hard-hitting storms inundating the islands over the last 2 weeks. By Sonia A. Rao. A resident in Oahu evacuated her home in knee-high water, leaving her husband's ashes behind. 70 people in a group that included children were surrounded by water and stranded at a campsite. Others found their cars had been submerged and their homes swept away. These are just some of the anecdotes that residents and officials from Hawaii have shared over the past week as a series of storms has pounded the islands, causing severe flooding. No deaths were reported, but about 200 people were rescued. Thousands more were evacuated, and at least hundreds of millions of dollars worth of damage was sustained. Here's what else to know about the floods. They were caused by storms called Kona lows. The flooding was largely caused by back-to-back storms that forecasters called Kona lows, a type of seasonal storm not uncommon during Hawaii's rainy season from November to April. Such storms tend to bring more precipitation and move more slowly, leading to heavy rain over the same location for extended periods of time. The first storm struck Hawaii on March 10th, when multiple inches of rain were received across the islands. The intense rainfall over just a few weeks, which experts said was one of the rainiest periods Hawaii has seen recently, saturated ground on parts of the islands, causing additional rain to flood streets. The National Weather Service is still assessing totals, but many parts of Hawaii received record rainfall amounts over the past few weeks. Oahu, Hawaii's most populous island and home to its state capital, saw severe rainfall on Friday that led to the catastrophic flooding. Meteorologists with the National Weather Service in Honolulu said Oahu received between 10 to 14 inches of rain overnight from Thursday into Friday, which led to the devastation, with more rainfall into the weekend. There were no recorded fatalities, but emergency responders, including airmen and high water vehicle teams deployed by the National Guard, rescued around 200 people. Over 5,000 people had been evacuated from Oahu's North Shore, one of the hardest hit areas. The rainfall had initially led state officials to declare a 100-year-old dam in the Waihae Reservoir in northern Oahu at imminent risk of failure. By Friday evening, water levels had reduced, and a spokesman for the company that owns the dam said it was operating as designed with no indications of damage. Regulators had classified the dam as having a high hazard potential, meaning failure would have most likely resulted in loss of life. Residents described seeing cars overturned, trucks washed downstream, and mud filling rooms in their homes. Hawaii's Governor Josh Green said he anticipated that storm damage across the islands could cost more than $1 billion in public and private property damage. Hawaii Farmers Union United, an advocacy group, said farms were particularly hard hit, estimating damage to crops and infrastructure at around $7 million. On Tuesday, Mr. Green announced that he had submitted a request to President Trump for a major disaster declaration to support statewide recovery efforts. Mr. Green said the flooding across the islands was the worst the state had seen in 20 years. Hawaii experienced significant flooding damage 2 decades ago when intense rainfall in October 2004 caused the Manoa Stream on the southern part of Oahu to overflow, resulting in flooding through residential areas and the campus of the University of Hawaii at Manoa. There were no deaths or injuries reported in that flood. Still, damages to the library and other buildings on campus, as well as over 100 homes in the area, were estimated at around $85 million. Over the weekend, the storm inched over to Maui, which had already sustained damage earlier in the month. Flash flood warnings and evacuation orders were issued on the island, and flooding was reported. On Monday, there were also reports of flash flooding in Manoa, a southern portion of the island of Oahu, as well as on the Big Island. Local news outlets reporting on the flooding in Manoa describe roads and walkways that turned into rivers and streams. The National Weather Service said water levels were at least 2 feet high, with parked cars being inundated. Rain continued to pour over Maui through Tuesday, with flood watches in effect for Maui and the Big Island through 6 p.m. on Tuesday. The storm system was expected to leave the area by Tuesday night. The next article from the arts section: Mozart wouldn't be Mozart without these 3 objects. By Joshua Barone and Karsten Moran. Salzburg is no place for my talent. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart once wrote of his Austrian hometown. In fact, his family spent much of its time there making plans to get out. His father, a court musician, repeatedly left to take his children on tour, showing them off in concerts across Europe. But while the Mozarts didn't love Salzburg, the city has never lost its affection for Wolfgang. His likeness is inescapable in window displays and on the wrappers of marzipan chocolates. Tourists visit the house where he was born and the more spacious home the family moved into as it became famous. Those sites are overseen by the Mozarteum Foundation of Salzburg, which maintains a vast collection of memorabilia and instruments. A number of its holdings, like the ink-stained portable clavichord on which Mozart wrote the Magic Flute, are on view in treasures from the Mozarteum Foundation of Salzburg at the Morgan Library and Museum through May 31st. The exhibition and its accompanying catalog cover the composer's entire life and legacy, but much of it is devoted to its foundational years in Salzburg, with objects that collectively illustrate how a boy of seemingly miraculous talent became the Mozart we know today. Here are 3 of those artifacts. First, his childhood violin. Wolfgang's father, Leopold, gave him this violin when he was 6 or 7. Much smaller than the standard size, it was made from spruce and maple by Andreas Ferdinand Mayer, one of Leopold's fellow court musicians. In the mid-1750s, Leopold published a treatise on how to play the instrument. Well received, it probably also helped him as he began to give lessons to his 2 children that had survived infancy, Wolfgang and Maria Anna, known as Nannerl. By the time Wolfgang received the violin, he was already improvising and writing for keyboard instruments, which he picked up with phenomenal ease. But he took a liking to his violin and began to compose sonatas for it. These are some of his earliest pieces, with multiple movements and a broader, more mature sense of form. Quartets followed, along with a series of concertos that have become staples of the repertoire. The violin is more notable for its provenance than its sound, which is modest and a little nasal. but it is also remarkable for how well it has been preserved. Children's instruments are often battered, but this one survived Wolfgang's peripatetic early years and custodianship in Nannerl's home and later private ownership, before landing with the Mozarteum in 1896. This fragment is the only surviving bit of music by Nannerl. Several years older than Wolfgang, she is the Mozart family's first prodigy. Nannerl learned from a notebook that Leopold gave her when she was 7. It's also on display, and it contains pieces written by a variety of composers, copied by hand and arranged in order of difficulty. Eventually, Wolfgang learned from the same collection, then began to attempt music of his own. The siblings toured together, but at some point, Wolfgang began to overshadow Nannerl. She was a brilliant harpsichordist, and her brother wrote 4 hand pieces for them that exploited her talent. Leopold, though, was more interested in selling his wunderkind son. After Wolfgang's death in 1791, Nannerl became his first biographer. She must have composed 2. Letters from her brother express amazement at her skill, but for a long time scholars had to take him at his word. 2 fragments of a score by her are in Paris and Augsburg, Germany. Recently, though, their conclusion was found in a collection given to the Morgan in 2019. That batch also included a sensational Chopin discovery. The museum's scrap had been miscredited to Wolfgang, but it was found to align with the 2 others. Now all 3 have been reunited, assembled as facsimiles and a manuscript in the exhibition, and offering the clearest possible impression of her music, a steadily walking bass line under 2-note phrases that rise and fall, ending with a natural and satisfying resolution. Wolfgang's childhood spent on the road saved him from the provincialism he would have been confined to in Salzburg. And as he matured into a constantly evolving master, he wove his cosmopolitan experiences into his music, to the delight of audiences then and now. For example, the finale of his piano sonata in A, Köchel 331, better known as the Rondo alla Turca, whose copyist manuscript is on view at the Morgan, opens with one of the most famous melodies in music. Reminiscent of Turkish military bands that were popular in Vienna at the time, it was practically made to be a hit, with bouncing rhythms, puckish ornamentation, and a winning exotic theme that returns again and again. Like much of Mozart's music, the rondo is also within reach for amateur musicians, which allowed it to be heard in homes throughout Austria when it was first published in 1784. It's still irresistible for young pianists who want to show off, not unlike little Wolfgang in his youth. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And the time is now approximately 29 minutes past the hour. And continuing in the arts section, President Trump's ballroom architect roasting in the hot seat. Shalom Baranis, who arrived in the U.S. as a Libyan refugee and went on to renovate the Pentagon, is baffling fellow architects for accepting the job. But he said some of his previous projects have drawn outrage too. By Elizabeth Buemiller. He is successful, rich, and approaching the end of a long career. So fellow architects and colleagues wonder why Shalom Baranis, who renovated the Pentagon, modernized the Treasury Department, and over 50 years changed much of the face of Washington, signed on to the headache of President Trump's White House ballroom. The $400 million, 90,000 square foot project has appalled preservationists, drawn tens of thousands of overwhelmingly critical comments from across the country, and prompted a lawsuit trying to shut it down. It has also earned Mr. Baranis the ire of other architects, 29 of whom said in an angry letter that the project would reduce the White House a little more than half the size of the addition to the tail wagging the dog. They urged him to decline the job. I don't understand why he would put himself in such a hot seat right now, said David M. Schwartz, a prominent Washington architect who has known Mr. Baranis since their days at the Yale School of Architecture. I am totally baffled why he would take this on, said Nancy McWood, a longtime Washington preservationist and civic leader who for decades has watched Mr. Baranis massage city review boards and make the case for his work. Mr. Baranis, 75, is under a non-disclosure agreement with the White House and declined to discuss his motivations and specifics about the project. But in an interview last week, his first since signing on to the ballroom, and in subsequent conversations, Mr. Baranis did say that 3/4 of his previous projects have ignited controversy, particularly in residential neighborhoods. He described his life story. He is the son of a tailor who once found unimaginable opportunities in America and expressed discomfort with the Trump administration's immigration policies. What's happening now is heartbreaking, Mr. Baranis said. I do hope there's a realization at some point that this country depends on immigration. We have to normalize our policies. Mr. Baranis also said that he did not take on the ballroom project, as some architects have speculated, because his architectural firm is in trouble. No, we're not laying people off right now, he said affably during an hour-and-a-half interview in his 9-bedroom, $8 million federal-style home in Georgetown, where 2 large Frank Stella prints and a smaller Salvatore Dali print hung in the living room. Half the space was dominated by a Roche Beaubois modular sofa covered in wake-me-up fuchsia grape, floral and striped fabrics from the Italian fashion house Missoni. Mr. Baranis said his firm currently employs 60 people, up from the 16 during the 1989-1990 downturn, but down from a high of 175 when he was simultaneously working on 6 buildings in the 10-acre city center D.C. downtown and repairing the Pentagon after the damage of the September 11, 2001 attacks. He declined to comment on how much he is being paid for the project, which Mr. Trump has said will be financed by private contributions. He also refused to address the outcry about the ballroom, including Mr. Trump's abrupt teardown of the East Wing, but he shrugged off neighborhood outrage about some of his previous work. There are a lot of complaints. Oh my God, he said. Every project I've ever done in Georgetown, somebody gets up there and says, this is the biggest building that will ever have been built in Georgetown. In many ways, Mr. Baranis is an odd choice, both personally and stylistically, for the president. He arrived in the United States as a 6-year-old Libyan refugee with parents fleeing the anti-Jewish riots in Tripoli after World War II. Decades later, he criticized gently Mr. Trump's first-term travel ban. My hope is that the Trump administration will take actions to ensure that the travel ban is indeed temporary, so that good, hard-working individuals fleeing tyranny can find a new home as I did. Mr. Baranis wrote in the Washington Post in March 2017, his hopes are far from realized. The second Trump administration has expanded the travel ban, ended virtually all visas for Libyans, and paused admission for the vast majority of refugees. Professionally, Mr. Baranis is known for his modern additions to Washington's historic buildings, not for the traditional style of the White House ballroom. Designing classical architecture would not necessarily speak to his bread and butter, said Rebecca Miller, the executive director of the D.C. Preservation League, a nonprofit group. But in other ways, Mr. Baranis is a natural fit for his mercurial president. known for his ability to work well with real estate developers who often push to make office buildings bigger and therefore more profitable. Mr. Baranis so far appears to be getting along with the former developer in the White House, who is deeply immersed in the project. Mr. Baranis meets regularly with Mr. Trump. If I had to pick who would do this job, it would be Shalom, said Richard Nash Gould, a New York architect and avid Trump supporter who has known Mr. Baranis since Yale and spoke to him recently about the ballroom. He's happy, he's bulletproof, and he's really smart. To Mr. Gould, it is no mystery why Mr. Baranis signed on. Why wouldn't he said. It's an incredibly interesting job. Colleagues say Mr. Baranis took on the project because he thought he could make it better after a previous architect, James McCreary, disagreed with Mr. Trump over its scale. To that end, Mr. Baranis told the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts in January that while the ballroom can seat a whopping 1,000 guests, it is not the most immense design the president considered. Mr. Baranis' latest plans have also removed a large pediment from above the ballroom's portico. He's done certain things that I actually think are good moves, said Priya Jain, an associate professor of architecture at Texas A&M University and chairwoman of the Heritage Conservation Committee of the Society of Architectural Historians. Still, the ballroom remains enormous, and the tweaks have done little to silence opponents. Paul Goldberger, a former architecture critic for the New York Times and the New Yorker, and the author of Why Architecture Matters, called the ballroom a huge, dumb box in a Times op-ed article last week. He added that it was nominally designed by Mr. Baranis, but for all intents and purposes, designed by Mr. Trump. Mr. Goldberger, who also knows Mr. Baranis from Yale, added that he is well suited to the task because of his abilities with developers and is able to produce work of whatever type and whatever style his clients want. Mr. Baranis took offense. That's kind of below the belt, he said. All my work is very contemporary. But the White House project is not contemporary at all. I can't comment on that, Mr. Baranis said, mindful of his NDA. The 6-year-old Mr. Baranis would likely not be admitted into the United States under the Trump administration restrictions of today. Back in the 1950s, his arrival by ship in New York Harbor was the start of an immigrant's classic American success story. His parents were Orthodox Sephardic Jews who left Libya in 1948 with a plan to eventually get to the new nation of Israel. They went first to Tunisia, then Rome, where Mr. Baranis and his sister were born, and where the elder Baranis, who made fine men's clothing in Tripoli, looked at photographs of Israeli men in cotton work shirts and khaki shorts in the newspapers of the time and realized, his son said, there isn't a single person in Israel wearing a suit. He could make a better living in America. In 1957, the refugee organization, then known as the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, secured the family visas to the United States and found a job as a tailor for the elder Mr. Baranis in Rochester, New York, a center of the men's clothing industry in the United States at the time. The young Mr. Baranis, who had arrived speaking only Italian, eventually went to a Rochester vocational school that taught plumbing and car mechanics, where he struggled until a teacher told his parents he was smart enough for Phillips Exeter Academy, the elite boarding school. Admitted in 1966 on a full scholarship, he was overwhelmed by the other students and intense academics. It was really lonely, he said. He went on to undergraduate studies at Yale, where he was inspired by the architecture historian Vincent Scully, and then to the architecture school itself. In 1976, he was passing through Washington with his new master's degree and serendipitously got a job at a Georgetown firm. 5 years later, he struck out on his own. He at first drew designs for a few CVS pharmacies and Roy Rogers restaurants, but got a break in 1982 when he was commissioned to add 2 floors to the top of a historic Beaux Arts confection, the southern building at 15th and H Streets downtown. It was the work of Daniel Burnham, an early 20th century giant from Chicago who had designed New York's Flatiron Building and Washington's Union Station. In 1978, the District of Columbia has passed one of the country's toughest historic preservation laws, a challenge for the 31-year-old Mr. Baranis, who had to get approval for the new floors from 2 review boards. He managed to convince them that architectural drawings he unearthed in Chicago indicated that Mr. Burnham had left open the possibility that 2 floors could be added on. Mr. Baranis brought them in right at a downtown Washington height limit of 130 feet. Other developers with historic properties took notice. They all have these buildings that are below the height limit, Mr. Baranis said, and this kid over here knows how to build additions. He went on to add floors to dozens of other historic properties by making the argument, he said, that it was the natural evolution of how cities grow, and you don't treat buildings as museum pieces. Mr. Baranis declined to say how he became to the attention of the White House, but it is hard these days to miss his work in Washington. In his half-century of business, he has designed a large modern glass addition to the General Services Administration, modernized the Interior Department, renovated the headquarters of the American Red Cross adjacent to the White House, and added a pavilion to MedStar Georgetown Hospital, among hundreds of other commercial and government projects. The White House ballroom is set to get the go-ahead by a panel packed with Trump allies on April 2nd. But on Tuesday, an exasperated federal judge indicated he might stop the construction already underway until the White House gets approval from Congress. During a hearing in a lawsuit brought by the National Trust for Historic Preservation, Judge Richard J. Leon of the Federal District Court of Washington, a President George W. Bush appointee, called one of the White House arguments in favor of the ballroom a brazen interpretation of the law. He noted that Mr. Trump is a steward of the White House, not its owner, and said he could rule by the end of the month. Mr. Baranis is in the meantime moving ahead with his plans, well aware that despite the giant body of his work in Washington, the Trump ballroom will be his legacy, and what many fellow architects say will not be in a good way. He remains outwardly cheerful. Washington, he said, looking out a floor-to-ceiling window to his swimming pool, has been a great place to practice. And now from the opinion section, here is a guest essay by Andrea Bartz titled, "The Shy Girl Fiasco Shows Why Trust in Writers is Plummeting." When readers ask questions about my thriller novels, I love to discuss the themes and characters in them and the inspiration for my writing. But as generative artificial intelligence worms its way through the publishing industry, I'm bracing for a stomach-turning query. Did you actually write this? The worry has been at the front of my mind since last week, when Hachette canceled the forthcoming U.S. publication of the horror novel Shy Girl, after readers and journalists flagged prose that sounded like AI slop. The author maintains that a freelance editor is to blame for any prose written by a large language model. Though I'm against the use of generative AI in creative writing, not everyone feels the same way. What does seem clear, however, is that most readers want disclosure when AI has been used, and they are quick to note the telltale rhythms and patterns of popular large language models. But as AI models continue to improve, I'm concerned that it will become difficult to distinguish between something written by a human versus a bot. As more AI-generated writing is put out in the world, more readers will question whether the text they are poring over was penned by a human. We're barreling toward a rapid erosion of trust between authors and readers, and the publishing industry is unprepared to deal with the consequences. Already with a little fine-tuning, chatbots can be eerily good mimics of published writers, nailing their word choices and go-to grammatical patterns. James Fry, an author who's no stranger to controversy and who has proudly admitted to using AI to write, has noted, "I have asked the AI to mimic my writing style so you, the reader, will not be able to tell what was written by me and what was generated by the AI." Shortly after ChatGPT was publicly released, I entered the prompt, "Write a short story in the style of author Andrea Bartz." The output was an uncanny facsimile of my prose. The actual scenes it generated made little sense, but the rhythm and sentences themselves mimic some of the deliberate stylistic choices I made in my books. AI detectors exist, but they're far from perfect. OpenAI has called them unreliable. I don't pretend to know how these checkers work under the hood, but if large language models were trained on my work, which was the case in at least one instance, then it's easy to see how my own writing may come across to some as AI generated. In other words, I don't write like AI. AI writes like me. I pasted a few paragraphs of my own prose, a quick satire piece I'd shared in my newsletter, into a free online detection tool. It deemed the passage very likely AI generated, with 82% of the text exhibiting the hallmarks of AI. This app appeared to be cruder and less reliable than other detectors I tried, but perhaps because it was pushing a feature to humanize my passage with the click of a button. Lord help us all. The relationship between artists and their patrons has always hinged on human connection. Though I have never met their authors, I cry when I read Sally Rooney's Intermezzo, snicker my way through Kurt Vonnegut's Breakfast of Champions, and feel my heart flip-flop when Mr. Darcy delivers his urgent line at the end of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. If your feelings are still what they were last April, tell me so at once. My affections and wishes are unchanged. But one word from you will silence me on the subject forever. Novelists write to wrestle with the human condition, to explore universal themes and alchemize their humanity into words that resonate with total strangers. If you remove the flesh and blood author from the equation or plant seeds of doubt in readers' minds about whether what they are consuming is authentically human, the writer-reader relationship falls apart. In a worst-case scenario, mistrust could bring with it rampant accusations of AI use, including as a bad faith tactic employed against enemies. By making bookworms paranoid about whether a poem or a passage they love was written by a person or an algorithm. It may also warp the act of reading itself. None of this bodes well for the future of publishing, an industry in decline, supported by fewer readers, paying authors unlivable wages. I fear could fall on us authors to prove our writing is our own. The advice I often hear from fellow authors is hopeful, if a bit hippy-dippy. Write something weird. Break all the rules. Pour your heart and soul into it because nobody can tell a story quite like you, baby. But in practical terms, there's little writers can do beyond documenting the laborious process of penning a long-form piece. When it comes to academic writing and legal briefs, eagle-eyed reviewers can look for hallucinated citations, proof the work was AI generated. For most writing, though, the primary indicator is alarmingly murky. Does this sound like ChatGPT to me? Several made-by-human certifications exist for written works, but many of these programs operate on the honor system, so the badge lacks teeth. In theory, the author of Shy Girl could have slapped the Authors Guild's human-authored stamp on its cover. It doesn't require detection tools. Book contracts typically state that authors' work must be original, but again, enforcement options are effectively limited to fallible AI checkers that often have a high rate of false positives and vibes. The cancellation of Shy Girl raises many concerns about trust, authenticity, and publishing's readiness for a new AI-assisted world. But one beautiful thing sprang from the fallout. Readers made it abundantly clear they want books by humans, not machines. This should hearten all the authors painstakingly getting words on the page one at a time, and frighten those secretly using generative AI as a shortcut to a finished draft. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The time is now about 51 minutes past the hour. Now an article from the Styles section. Baby carrots and espresso martinis. How New Yorkers prepared for a 5-hour opera. Audiences packed the house for a new production of Tristan and Isolde. They also came prepared with at least 5 different forms of coffee. By Louis Lucero II. It was the first intermission at the Metropolitan Opera's buzzy new Tristan and Isolde, and Ricardo Perez was feeling good. Mr. Perez, a senior at Boston College, had splurged on a $200 ticket to last Monday's premiere after writing a term paper about the Wagner opera in his sophomore year. In the half-hour break before Act 2, he had lightly caffeinated with a small white teacup of Irish coffee, but his secret weapon, a pack of Zyn, the 6-milligram pillows of nicotine that can be found wedged in many a Gen Z cheek, remained untouched. Mr. Perez was pleased not to have dipped into his supply in Act 1, which he said was the hardest to get through. In all Wagner operas, he added, the first act is just endless exposition. The Met's new production of Tristan opened last week to rave reviews, with critics praising the miraculous singing and innovative yet audience-friendly staging. Saturday's performance will be screened live in theaters nationwide. But for many New Yorkers, there is no soprano so celestial, no aria so transporting, that a nearly 4-hour opera, 5 with intermissions, can be faced without some bucking up. For her first visit to the Met, Allegra Myers of the Bronx had pre-gamed with a yerba mate energy drink. But like Mr. Perez, she also had a little something extra up her sleeve. Standing at the head of the Opera House's grand staircase, she produced a plastic canister of chocolate candies filled with coffee cream. "Would you like one?" she asked, offering a gold-wrapped bonbon to a reporter. He accepted. Broadly speaking, caffeine seemed to be the drug of choice at the first 2 performances of the opera. Roxanne Zhao, 27, a construction project manager, said on Friday that she had an espresso shot at 4 p.m., an hour later than her usual last call for caffeine. "Not too crazy," she said, "but yes, I did prep myself." Standing near the bar on the Opera House's grand tier, just beneath one of the Met's 2 36-foot Chagall murals, Ms. Zhao wondered whether the bartenders might be able to whip up an espresso martini. "It might be needed at one of the intermissions," she said. Friday's performance was one of several under 40 nights scattered throughout the season, offering discounted tickets to opera goers ages 40 and under. The Met's efforts to make inroads with younger audiences come at a time of great financial precariousness for the performing arts organization, the largest in the United States. To wit, the Met is considering selling the Chagalls to help make ends meet. Peter Gelb, the Mets general manager, described the new production as an epic event that more than justified its 5-hour running time, adding that it's still a lot shorter than an all-night rave. Audiences of all ages are attracted to larger-than-life experiences, and that's what we're offering, Mr. Gelb said in a statement. We love that our audience arrives ready to be transformed. Whether caffeinated or not, Tristan should prove to be a stimulating and mind-altering experience. On Friday, at an Amarino Gelato shop just across Columbus Avenue from the Opera House, 2 young opera goers fueled up with affogatos, espresso-drizzled Italian ice cream, before the curtain. Julia Kravchik and Geva Avnet, classmates at Hunter College High School, estimated that they each saw about half a dozen operas a year. This is definitely the longest opera that I'm going to see, Ms. Kravchik said. That's certainly true this season. At 4 hours and 50 minutes, the 3-act Tristan und Isolde has a full hour on the next longest opera at the Mets' 25-26 slate, Strauss's Arabella. But such is the surety of youth that Mr. Avnet was unfazed by the prospect of final bows coming sometime after 11 p.m., despite having gotten up for school at 6:40 that morning. I'm hoping I'll be able to just, power through, he said. Many in attendance on Friday were grateful for the opportunity to sleep in on Saturday. One audience member said she purposely didn't make any plans for the next morning. Chen Shen Wang, 37, went a step further and planned to show herself some grace if the coziness of the darkened theater should get the best of her. I'm also prepared to forgive myself if I do doze off, she said. A sainted few had packed fruits and vegetables for the occasion. One man spoke of the benefits of the humble apple, which he said released its energy slowly, suggesting it could offer a more sustained boost than other snacks. And though Joel Campana, who works at Hugo Boss, might have been thinking more about hunger than drowsiness, he still deserved credit for modeling healthful habits at the opera. I have baby carrots in my bag, Mr. Campana, 34, said, indicating a Marc Jacobs tote printed with a repeated black and white photo of Maria Callas as Medea. With all due respect to fruits and veggies, the Mets' caffeinated offerings carry the day at the first performances of Tristan. And while Ms. Zhao might have been pleased to find that the Met did have espresso martinis on offer, she would have needed to act fast. The Grand Tier bar had sold out of the drinks by the first intermission. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the March 26th issue of the New York Times. Your reader has been Ken Kominski. Thank you for listening.